Hey YouTube, what is going on? Thanks for checking out the Straight SRT8 YouTube channel where we discuss all things SRT8 related. Now today I want to talk about our fuel gauge. So it's going to obviously apply directly to Jeep SRTs and Jeep Trackhawks. More broadly, it's probably going to apply to the whole SRT family. I'd be surprised if they change this throughout the SRT family. It's probably going to apply to actually all Jeeps, maybe even all Chryslers. At least portions of this is going to apply to different product families. So what I want to talk about is how accurate is our range and how accurate is our fuel meter. So if I turn on around the camera real quick, we can see that our fuel gauge at the top where it's full, and then your major markers going to 3/4, a half, and a quarter, they get smaller towards the bottom. So there's a pretty big difference in size there. It kind of gets gradually smaller towards the bottom, and then it's more spacious towards the top. So to me, that says the engineers knew the tank wasn't a perfect square. So in a perfect square tank, you have individual slices, they're all even. Your first slice is the same width or thickness as your second slice, third slice, so on and so forth. So you get even intervals through the whole tank. So as your bobber moves down your fuel tank, it says, yep, when I'm a quarter of the way down, I'm at a quarter of a tank. When I'm halfway the way down, I'm at half of a tank. In reality, though, that isn't how tanks are designed. Tanks are designed to squeeze into different areas. So they kind of like a weird shape to them. So from an initial perspective, looking at this one, there's more spacing towards full and there's less spacing towards E. So to me, the tank's kind of like this, where you want to travel a greater distance at the top because it's very narrow. And then you want to travel a smaller distance towards the bottom because it's wider. So you want to make sure the area up here equals the area down here. So to me, the tank's kind of like this, looking at how this is designed. Which I thought was an awesome idea, right? The engineers know the tank isn't perfect. They're trying to make it perfect by changing the measurement system. Awesome idea. But did it actually work? Which I cover a pretty big amount of detail in a second. So I started off by saying, well, I want to convert gallons to miles. So I could do gallons to gallons, which meaning that I fill up my tank. When the fuel tank stops, I stop. So to be as accurate as possible, I use the same fuel pump at the same location time and time again. So that helps eliminate some variation when the pumps stop. And then I didn't bother topping it off. Whenever the fuel pump stops, that's when I stop. I use that same metric for several months. So ranging from like -9 Fahrenheit temperatures up to about 95, almost 100 Fahrenheit temperatures. So several months of this study. And the one deficiency is that I was forced to convert gallons to miles. So I had to rely on my MPG. So I would drive, as instance, I'd fill up the tank, right? We're at full. I would drive, let's say, to 3/4 of a tank. So I drove a quarter of a tank distance. And I recorded mileage at a quarter of a tank. So I knew what it was at full. I knew what it was at a quarter of a tank. And I did that for 8th tank measurements. So I knew exactly how many miles I drove. And then I recorded my MPG, which averaged around 15.5. I did some quick math and determined how many gallons that was. So I'm really equating mileage to gallons. So there's going to be a difference there depending on how I drive. I drove very consistently though. I wasn't flooring it. I wasn't going extra slow. My mileage ranged from, I would say, mostly city, but it was longer stretches of stopping. So it's almost like highway driving in combination with some city driving. So it was an even distribution throughout. There wasn't like at every full tank I did this and every empty tank I did this. It was always a giant mix. So when I compared my data for across several months, it was very, very repeatable. So I know that my driving style was consistent. I know that at individual markers, let's say I was supposed to drive 40 miles for one marker, it would compare, it'd be like 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. They were very, very tight intervals. So very, very repeatable data. So my data collection system may have had some inherent inaccuracies, but the way I collected it was very accurate. So that being said, looking at the fuel tank, I made some assumptions before I even collected the data, and the data surprised me. It wasn't quite what I thought. So what we're going to get into in a second is we're going to look at estimated range. How accurate is our estimated range in the vehicle, and how accurate is our fuel gauge? Do they compare to one another? Is one more accurate than the other one? Is one more erroneous? And I compared, looking at the fuel gauge, I looked at 2 different inherent measurements in the fuel gauge. The first was, independent of anything, if I'm at a half tank, am I truly at half my mileage? If I'm at a quarter tank, am I truly at a quarter of my mileage? That's my first measurement. My second measurement was, if I look at the spacing, let's say from a full to 3/4, look at that spacing. Look at my half to a quarter spacing, and quarter to a zero spacing, and so on and so forth. Is that width of the marker correct, or are they incorrect? Now, this matters because if my first marker is wrong, that error differential carries through the rest of my measurement system. So let's say at 3/4 of a tank, I'm supposed to be at 3/4 of a tank, but I'm really at like half of a tank. Well, no matter what the other measurements are, they're all going to be inaccurate because that first one was so erroneous, it carries that error forward. So two different measurement systems looking at for the fuel gauge. But did a lot of talking. Just want to let you guys know what my thought process was, how repeatable the data was, and how I tried to maximize my data collection over, again, several months to make sure that was very repeatable. So all that data analysis coming at you right now. So here we are at the computer, and in front of us in this range of chart, we're going to go over the range first, which is your estimated range the vehicle tells you, and then hop into our fuel gauge and then other comparisons therein. But beginning with the fuel range, we're going to check on my actual mileage I drove at each individual marker. So from a full tank, 7/8, 6/8, 5/8, so on and so forth. Per those markers, how accurate is my actual range? So by the end of my empty tank, I know what my range is supposed to be on average over all my months of driving. I compare that into eighth increments, so I times it by an eighth, and then by 2/8 and by 3/8, etc., to get my true accuracy for that mileage marker and compare it to what the range is telling me it's supposed to be. So it's really a comparison of range to range or miles to miles. So my first tanker marker, I'm always going to be full at 100%. Of course, it's always going to be 100% because it's always going to be full there. Empty is always going to be empty. By default, it's always going to be 100% too. So what really matters is the data in between. So my first marker at 7/8 of a tank, remember we're driving from a full down. So my first marker is full, then goes to 7/8. It tells me I'm a little bit higher. So by higher, it means that I'm overestimating, or the car is overestimating the mileage left. So there are actually less miles left than what it's showing. So at 7/8, it may tell me I have, say, 300 miles left to empty. It may be like 295. So it's overestimating. At 6/8, it's perfect. Again, overestimates, and then here it underestimates. So we're underestimating. It means that I have more miles left than it's telling me. But on average, if I average all these points together, the fuel tanker or the range mileage reads higher, 3% higher. So on average, it's 103%. So it's very, very close to reality. So if you actually want to measure how much mileage you have less, ignore your fuel gauge, look at your estimated range. It's going to be very, very accurate, which is awesome. And this kind of explains why there's a little bit of a difference between different mileage markers. Now, the next graphs we get into are going to be markers based on comparing range, which is my comparison measurement, compares the range to the fuel gauge. But this first one right here looks at the fuel gauge alone. How accurate is my fuel gauge? Now, as I mentioned in the beginning part of this video, I am converting gallons to miles, and that has a direct correlation on MPG, which of course depends on how I drive my vehicle. So throughout this entire range, as I said before, I try driving consistently, using a combination of city and highway miles. But for the most part, I didn't do any crazy slow driving. I didn't try and manipulate any data. I didn't floor it. I didn't race or anything like that. So it's been very, very consistent, on average, of 15.5 miles per gallon across my entire sweep for our several months. So there is that caveat, though, that converting gallons to miles can have a little bit of error in there. So my next graph here shows, independent of my estimated range, which is my first graph, how accurate is just the fuel gauge itself. So I ignore my full marker because by default that's 100%. The empty, again, as default, it's going to be 100%, so you want to ignore this one too. But this really shows my trend is how accurate is my fuel gauge at each individual marker. So again, for my 7/8 of a tank, I'm going to know on average I get, say, 330 miles per tank. I times that by 1/8, and that tells me over the course of the eighth of a tank, I should be at X mileage, and I'm actually at this mileage. So how they compare as a ratio, I'm at 92%. So again, similar as before, anything over 100% means the fuel gauge overestimates mileage left, which means there are actually less miles left than it shows. And the opposite also occurs if the fuel gauge underestimates, meaning it's under 100%, and there are more miles left than it's actually appearing to show. So for this instance, in all these instances, you actually have more gas in your tank than it actually is indicating at these different intervals. But that being set aside, how accurate is it on average? On average, you're at 90% accuracy. So all these averaged together are hovering around 90%. So if we remember back to the estimated range, that was at 103% accuracy, and this is at 90%. So by far, your best measurement method for knowing how much mileage you have left per tank is using your estimated range. Now it gets a little interesting because if we look at our actual gauge itself, the mileage or the markers are spaced out differently. As we go from a full to 7/8, there's more space in between each marker. And then as we go towards empty, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, when I looked at that, I assumed that the engineers were trying to say, well, the tank's not perfectly square. It's going to have some oblong shape to it. And so I'm making the full gauge to the 7/8 gauge wider because that portion of the tank is smaller. And on average, we're trying to make these gauges be 100% accurate. But we can see here that it isn't really the case. We hover at 90% accuracy and then kind of drop down, which tells me that as we get towards the lower portion of the tank, so from your 2/8, your 3/8 to 2/8, your 2/8 to an eighth, and your eighth to empty, that those markers are much smaller in between each other, but in reality, those are actual errors. Those markers should be wider apart. And these ones should be a little bit different too. So it's telling me that it's not, the gauge itself isn't quite perfect in the way the engineers designed it to have different spacing. Because we can see in our gauge, there's definitely a difference in spacing from your full to your, 7/8, 6/8, 5/8, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a little interesting. So I tried figuring out, well, why is this occurring? But before I do that, I want to show you guys, in comparison of the fuel gauge to the range, how they stack up, marker to marker. And that's right here. So we can see our orange line, this burnt orange, is a perfect gauge, meaning it's always at 100% accuracy across the entire range. And then in our blue is our fuel gauge. We can see it kind of drops off in accuracy, hovers around here, and then tanks. In comparison, our range hovers around this 100% line pretty well, besides the spot right here. But other than that, it's pretty accurate. So comparing mileage on a fuel gauge to, of course, your estimated range is going to be more accurate. But this data right here is pretty interesting too. So we got to keep in mind that when you're talking about a fuel gauge, there are two ways to measure a fuel gauge. There is individual marker distance. So let's say the data from 7/8 of a tank to 6/8 of a tank. You take this data comparison to this data, and you understand what the spacing is. So let's say from here to here, it's supposed to be 44 miles. But in reality, the gauge is showing 45 miles or 48 miles. So there's a little bit of an error in between the two markers. But when you measure the gauge overall, you compound error, which means that if this measurement here is off by roughly 10%, then all of these other measurements by default absorb that error and are all going to be off by 10% too. So what it really means is right here, where I'm not changing accuracy, I'm willing to bet these points are almost 100% accurate. But the reason they're at 90 is because this guy was off by 10%. He pulled them down. And then these guys right here are just in gross error. But this is compound error. So it tells me that my 7/8 to 6/8 marker distance is correct. And my 6/8 to 5/8 all the way down to 3/8 roughly are all correctly spaced from each other. But they're all in error because this first marker is way off. So there are different ways to view the fuel gauge. And this next chart really breaks it down in much more detail. And this is easy to understand, but also it's kind of complex. Because you got to consider that as you look at a fuel gauge and you want to see, okay, well, I'm at half of a tank. I'm already at half a tank. This will tell you that. And we can see it right here at a half of a tank. It's saying this marker itself is pretty accurate. But in the overall scheme of things, it's only at 90%. So it's off by itself. But it's because other markers are off. So I explain that better in the next chart. So this looks at actual marker accuracy. So again, what I did is we have in orange here is your true mileage per marker, which means as I went from full to 7/8, I subtract my full mileage to my 7/8 of a tank mileage. That gives me some mileage. And I compare that to what should be a perfect tank. So right here, a perfect tank marker is 44.625 miles per marker at an average of 15.5 miles per gallon, which says when I go from a full tank to 7/8 of a tank, I should have gone 44.625 miles. In reality though, our orange is reality. It's telling me for this one, I actually went 71 miles on average. So there's a huge difference in between what I should have driven and what I actually drove, and comparing my true perfect gauge accuracy to reality. So right here, you can see this gauge is off by quite a bit. Percentage-wise, we're at 160%. It's way, way, way off. So by default, this data is going to skew all the other data down here. And that's why, even though these are at almost 100% accuracy, they are inaccurate because this guy skewed all that data. So they can see right here for basically the balance of my markers, we're at pretty even distribution. Some are off by a little bit, but it isn't until empty where we're way, way off. We're at 72%. So a 28% error here and a 59% error here. So these two really skew the data, which tells me that when the engineers built the gauge, this is in the wrong spot and this is in the wrong spot. And if they course corrected this one and course correct this one, we'd be a very parallel gauge. Now, let's compare this again to the previous indicator. So the first one shows a huge difference here of gross error. Look at this chart. This chart. We see a huge error here in terms of accuracy. That remains pretty flat. It's from 7/8 down to, let's say, 3/8. Let's go to here. From 7/8 down to 3/8. For the most part, it's pretty accurate. And then these two are very accurate, and that drops. But we got to keep in mind here is that this isn't saying accuracy at a quarter tank. It's saying when I subtract the values or the mileage from 3/8 to a quarter, so that transition period, that the spacing in between these two is correct. And this chart doesn't do that. This chart says, in terms of overall mileage, how accurate is this point in time in comparison to where it should be. So they're not going to match perfectly, but it tells me that the spacing for these measurements, the spacing from a full to a 7/8 and the spacing from a 7/8 to a 6/8, that spacing for the most part is accurate, but this guy is very, very inaccurate and this guy is very inaccurate. So it would mean shift everything higher in order to make this smaller and make this taller and course correct everything. So doing so, if we take this data and we pulled it higher and mean shifted it, by default this data line right here would be right here, a little bit higher. And these gross bumps wouldn't be as gross. They'd be a little bit inaccurate, not crazy inaccurate. So this mean shift here and this mean shift here would pull the whole data closer to being accurate. So because of that, we're saying in reality, these guys are great, but these two are going to be inaccurate. So my initial estimates when I first looked at the gauge was saying, oh, the engineers are trying to space the gauge out differently to account for the non-normal shape of the fuel tank. And they did, but in reality they got 2 points a little bit wrong. Now again, keep in mind that this is me estimating mileage to fuel tank gallons. So to be more accurate, what I could have done was said, I'm going to drive 1/8 of a tank. And instead of comparing my mileage, I want to go back to my fuel pump and fill it back up and know the exact amount of gallons used to go this 1/8 of a tank. And now I'm going to drive to a 3/4 tank. And I'm going to put gas in my car and fill it back up to 100% and know the exact amount of gallons that have gone through for this area. But when you think about that, that's going to take a very, very long time to go through an entire tank. And then doing that for months and months and months and months, you'd get a lot less data points. They'd probably be more accurate, but you have a lot less data points. Instead, what I did was just record mileage over that entire time period. So there's going to be some inaccuracies by default in my measurement system, but this is the best I could do. Now, when comparing my data across the several months, it's very, very repeatable, which means that when I look at my mileage of how far I drove from full to 7/8 tank across all that time span, they're very, very accurate. You're talking about being off by 1 or 2%. And the same thing goes to the rest of my measurements. They're very, very repeatable through all these seasons, all these temperatures, all these driving methods. It's extremely repeatable in terms of mileage. So that tells me that my data collection itself is very, very repeatable and probably pretty accurate, but not as accurate as it could be. Now, before we go any further, there are some key takeaways. I'll make sure we kind of pull this back to reality a little bit. So one very important key takeaway is that your estimated range, again, is a way better way of measuring the amount of mileage you have till empty in comparison to your fuel gauge. Another great takeaway is once your fuel gauge is exactly on the E marker, on the empty marker, you have about 1.2 gallons of fuel left. So if you're driving city, you got maybe like 10 or so miles. And if you're driving highway, you may have like 20 miles or so. But when you're exactly on empty, you have 1.2 gallons of fuel left. Again, on average, across all my measurements. Now, when your fuel light comes on, roughly, you have about 4.4 gallons of fuel left in your car. So, given a 15.5 or 15 mile per gallon average, you got about 50 miles left on your tank. So you got a decent distance to go to a fuel pump. So let's say you're on the thruway and your fuel light comes on, you're like, oh man, I gotta pull over. It's telling me I got 30 miles left. Well, it's telling you 30 to be safe. You have more than 30 left in the car, but I really wouldn't push it. When your range starts flashing and says you got 30 miles, it's a good bet that you got about 30 miles left. You have more, of course, in reserves, but you really don't want to push it, because when you push it too far, you start pulling up all the gunk at the bottom of your tank. There may be debris in there that got past your fuel filter. There may be whatever kind of dirt inside your tank. You're going to pull that up and suck it into your engine and then start clogging your fuel injectors. So it's really best to not try and push it. I would not continue that beyond that 1.2 gallons, of course. Once you're on empty, I would just see you're empty and I would stop and immediately fuel up. Or if you can, try and fuel up at your fuel light. Now in the wintertime, I almost never have my tank go beyond being half full or half empty, however you look at it. Because in the wintertime, when you got snow and you got sleet, you got ice, you have hazardous conditions, you don't want to be in a case where your car is on empty and you're stranded and you run out of gas and you start freezing. So I always have at least a half tank in my car at any point throughout the winter, just for the extra safety margin. So guys, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the content. I tried making it as easy to understand as possible. There are some known inaccuracies in my data, but hopefully by me explaining everything the way I did, looking at estimated range, looking at fuel gauge accuracy, and independent of fuel gauge accuracy, looking at your marker, distance from each marker, hopefully that all makes a lot of sense to you guys. If you have questions, as always, drop them below.